The Second Boer War was fought from October 11, 1899 until May 31, 1902 by the United Kingdom against the South African Republic and the Orange Free State. The British war effort was supported by troops from all over the British Empire. The war ended in victory for Britain and the annexation of both republics. Both would eventually be incorporated into the Union of South Africa in 1910. Name: the conflict is commonly referred to as simply the Boer War, since the First Boer War is much less well known. Boers was the common term for Afrikaans-speaking settlers in southern Africa at the time. It is also known as the South African War outside South Africa and as the Anglo-Boer War among South Africans. In Afrikaans it may be called the Anglo-Boer-Oorlog, Tweede Boerenoorlog, Tweede Vryheidsoorlog or Engelsoorlog. Origins. The complex origins of the war resulted from more than a century of conflict between the Boers and the British Empire, but of particular immediate importance was the question as to which white nation would control and benefit most from the very lucrative Witwatersrand gold mines. During the Napoleonic Wars, a British military expedition landed in the Cape Colony and defeated the defending Dutch forces at the Battle of Blouberg. After the war, the British formally acquired the colony, and encouraged immigration by British settlers who were largely at odds with the Dutch settlers. Many Boers who were dissatisfied with aspects of British administration, in particular with Britain's abolition of slavery on December 1, 1834, elected to migrate away from British rule in what became known as the Great Trek. The trekkers initially followed the eastern coast towards Natal and then, after Britain annexed the Natal in 1843, journeyed northwards towards the interior. There they established two independent Boer republics, the South African Republic and the Orange Free State. The British recognised the two Boer republics in 1852 and 1854, but attempted British annexation of the Transvaal in 1877 led to the First Boer War in 1880–81. After the British suffered defeats, particularly at the Battle of Majuba Hill, the independence of the two republics was restored subject to certain conditions. Relations, however, remained uneasy. In 1866 Erasmus Jacobs discovered diamonds at Kimberley, prompting a diamond rush and a massive influx of foreigners to the borders of the Orange Free State. Then in 1886, an Australian discovered gold in the Witwatersrand area of the South African Republic. Gold made the Transvaal the richest and potentially the most powerful nation in southern Africa. However, the country had neither the manpower nor the industrial base to develop the resource on its own. As a result, the Transvaal reluctantly acquiesced to the immigration of Witlanders, mainly from Britain, who came to the Boer region in search of fortune and employment. This resulted in the number of Witlanders in the Transvaal potentially exceeding the number of Boers, and precipitated confrontations between the earlier arrived Boer settlers and the newer, non-Boer arrivals. British expansionist ideas as well as disputes over Witlander political and economic rights resulted in the failed Jameson Raid of 1895. Dr. Leander Starr Jameson, who led the raid, intended to encourage an uprising of the Witlanders in Johannesburg. However, the Witlanders did not take up arms in support, and Transvaal government forces surrounded the column and captured Jameson's men before they could reach Johannesburg. As tensions escalated, political maneuverings and negotiations attempted to reach compromise on the issues of the rights of the Witlanders within the South African Republic, control of the gold mining industry, and the British desire to incorporate the Transvaal and the Orange Free State into a federation under British control. Given the British origins of the majority of Witlanders and the ongoing influx of new Witlanders into Johannesburg, the Boers recognised that granting full voting rights to the Witlanders would eventually result in the loss of ethnic Boer control in the South African Republic. To the satisfaction of Lord Milner, British High Commissioner for South Africa, the June 1899 negotiations in Bloemfontein failed, and in September 1899 British Colonial Secretary Joseph Chamberlain demanded full voting rights and representation for the Witlanders residing in the Transvaal. Paul Kruger, the President of the South African Republic, issued an ultimatum on October 9, 1899, giving the British government 48 hours to withdraw all their troops from the borders of both the Transvaal and the Orange Free State, failing which the Transvaal, allied to the Orange Free State, would declare war on the British government. the British government rejected the South African Republic's ultimatum, resulting in the South African Republic and Orange Free State declaring war on Britain. Phases. The war had three distinct phases. In the first phase, the Boers mounted preemptive strikes into British-held territory in Natal and the Cape Colony, besieging the British garrisons of Ladysmith, Mafeking and Kimberley. The Boers then won a series of tactical victories at Colenso, Majesfontein and Sionkop. In the second phase, after the introduction of greatly increased British troop numbers under the command of Lord Roberts, the British launched another offensive in 1900 to relieve the sieges, this time achieving success. After Natal and the Cape Colony were secure, the British were able to invade the Transvaal, and the Republic's capital, Pretoria, was ultimately captured in June 1900. In the third and final phase, beginning in March 1900, the Boers launched a protracted hard-fought guerrilla war against the British forces, lasting a further 2 years, during which the Boers raided targets such as British troop columns, telegraph sites, railways and storage depots. In an effort to cut off supplies to the raiders, the British, now under the leadership of Lord Kitchener, responded with a scorched earth policy of destroying Boer farms and moving civilians into concentration camps. Some parts of the British press and British government expected the campaign to be over within months, and the protracted war gradually became less popular, especially after revelations about the conditions in the concentration camps. The Boer forces finally surrendered on Saturday, 31 May 1902, with 54 of the 60 delegates from the Transvaal and Orange Free State voting to accept the terms of the peace treaty. This was known as the Treaty of Vereeniging, and under its provisions, the two republics were absorbed into the British Empire, with the promise of self-government in the future. This promise was fulfilled with the creation of the Union of South Africa in 1910. The war had a lasting effect on the region and on British domestic politics. For Britain, the Second Boer War was the longest, the most expensive, and the bloodiest conflict between 1815 and 1914, lasting 3 months longer and resulting in higher British casualties than the Crimean War. Background. The southern part of the African continent was dominated in the 19th century by a set of struggles to create within it a single unified state. While the Berlin Conference of 1884 Euro-5 sought to draw boundaries between the European powers' African possessions, it also set the stage for further scrambles. The British attempted to annex first the South African Republic in 1880, and then, in 1899, both the South African Republic and the Orange Free State. In 1868, the British annexed Basutoland in the Drakensberg Mountains following an appeal from Moshesh, the leader of a mixed group of African refugees from the Zulu Wars, who sought British protection against the Boers. In the 1880s, Bechuanaland became the object of a dispute between the Germans to the west, the Boers to the east, and the British Cape Colony to the south. Although Bechuanaland had no economic value, the missionaries' road passed through it towards territory further north. After the Germans annexed Damaraland and Namaqualand in 1884, the British annexed Bechuanaland in 1885. In the First Boer War of 1880–81, the Boers of the Transvaal Republic has proved skillful fighters in resisting the British attempt at annexation, causing a series of British defeats. The British government of William Ewart Gladstone had been unwilling to become mired in a distant war, requiring substantial troop reinforcement and expense, for what was at the time perceived to be a minimal return. An armistice followed, ending the war, and subsequently a peace treaty was signed with the Transvaal President Paul Kruger. However, when, in 1886, a major gold field was discovered at an outcrop on a large ridge some 60 kilometers south of the Boer capital at Pretoria, it reignited British imperial interests. The ridge, known locally as the Witwatersrand, contained the world's largest deposit of gold-bearing ore. Although it was not as rich as gold finds in Canada and Australia, its consistency made it especially well suited to industrial mining methods. With the 1886 discovery of gold in the Transvaal, the resulting gold rush brought thousands of British and other prospectors and settlers from across the globe and over the border from the Cape Colony. The city of Johannesburg sprang up as a shanty town nearly overnight as the Witlanders poured in and settled around the mines. The influx was such that the Witlanders quickly outnumbered the Boers in Johannesburg and along the Rand, although they remained a minority in the Transvaal as a whole. The Boers, nervous and resentful of the Witlanders' growing presence, sought to contain their influence through requiring lengthy residential qualifying periods before voting rights could be obtained, by imposing taxes on the gold industry, and by introducing controls through licensing, tariffs and administrative requirements. Among the issues giving rise to tension between the Transvaal governments on the one hand, and the Witlanders and British interests on the other, were, established Witlanders, including the mining magnates, wanted political, social, and economic control over their lives. These rights included a stable constitution, a fair franchise law, an independent judiciary, and a better educational system. The Boers, for their part, recognized that the more concessions they made to the Witlanders the greater the likelihood with approximately 30,000 white male Boer voters and potentially 60,000 white male Witlanders that their independent control of the Transvaal would be lost and the territory absorbed into the British Empire. The Witlanders resented the taxes levied by the Transvaal government, particularly when this money was not spent on Johannesburg or Witlander interests, but diverted to projects elsewhere in the Transvaal. For example, as the gold-bearing ore sloped away from the outcrop underground to the south, more and more blasting was necessary for extraction, and mines consumed vast quantities of explosives. A box of dynamite costing £5 included 5 shillings tax. Not only was this tax perceived as exorbitant, but British interests were offended when President Paul Kruger gave monopoly rights for the manufacture of the explosive to a non-British branch of the Nobel Company, which infuriated the British. The so-called dynamite monopoly became a major pretext for war. British imperial interests were alarmed when in 1894 €95 Kruger proposed building a railway through Portuguese East Africa to Delagoa Bay, bypassing British-controlled ports in Natal and Cape Town and avoiding British tariffs. At the time the Prime Minister of the Cape Colony was Cecil Rhodes, a man driven by a vision of a British-controlled Africa extending from Cape to Cairo. Certain self-appointed Witlanders representatives and British mine owners became increasingly angered and frustrated by their dealings with the Transvaal government. A reform committee was formed to represent the Witlanders. Jameson Raid. In 1895, a plan was hatched with the connivance of the Cape Prime Minister Cecil Rhodes and Johannesburg gold magnate Alfred Bate to take Johannesburg, ending the control of the Transvaal government. A column of 600 armed men was led by Dr. Leander Starr Jameson, of which Cecil Rhodes was the chairman, over the border from Bechuanaland towards Johannesburg. The column was equipped with Maxim machine guns, and some artillery pieces. The plan was to make a 3-day dash to Johannesburg before the Boer commandos could mobilize, and once there, trigger an uprising by the primarily British expatriate workers organised by the Reform Committee. However, the Transvaal authorities had advance warning of the Jameson Raid and tracked it from the moment it crossed the border. 4 days later, the weary and dispirited column was surrounded near Krugersdorp within sight of Johannesburg. After a brief skirmish in which the column lost 65 killed and wounded while the Boers lost but 1 man, Jameson's men surrendered and were arrested by the Boers. The botched raid resulted in repercussions throughout southern Africa and in Europe. In Rhodesia, the departure of so many policemen enabled the Matabele and Mashona tribes to rise up against the Chartered Company, and the rebellion, known as the Second Matabele War, was suppressed only at great cost. A few days after the raid, the German Kaiser sent a telegram congratulating President Kruger and the government of the South African Republic on their success, and when the text of this telegram was disclosed in the British press, it generated a storm of anti-German feeling. In the baggage of the raiding column, to the great embarrassment of the British, the Boers found telegrams from Cecil Rhodes and the other plotters in Johannesburg. Joseph Chamberlain, the British colonial secretary, quickly moved to condemn the raid, despite previously having approved Rhodes' plans to send armed assistance in the case of a Johannesburg uprising. Subsequently, Rhodes was severely censured at the Cape Inquiry and the London Parliamentary Inquiry, and forced to resign as Prime Minister of the Cape and as Chairman of the Chartered Company for having sponsored the failed coup d'etat copyright tat. The Boer government handed their raid prisoners over to the British for trial. Dr. Jameson was tried in England for leading the raid. However, the British press and London society, inflamed by anti-Boer and anti-German feeling and in a frenzy of jingoism, lionised Dr. Jameson and treated him as a hero. Although sentenced to 15 months imprisonment, Jameson was later rewarded by being named Prime Minister of the Cape Colony and ultimately anointed as one of the founders of the Union of South Africa. For conspiring with Jameson, the Witlander members of the Reform Committee were tried in the Transvaal courts and found guilty of high treason. The 4 leaders were sentenced to death by hanging, but this sentence was next day commuted to 15 years imprisonment. And in June 1896, the other members of the committee were released on payment of £82,000 each in fines, all of which were paid by Cecil Rhodes. One Reform Committee member, Frederick Grey, had committed suicide while in Pretoria jail, on May 16, and his death was a factor in softening the Transvaal government's attitude to the remaining prisoners. Jan C. Smuts wrote in 1906, "The Jameson Raid was the real declaration of war. And that is so in spite of the 4 years of truce that followed. The aggressors consolidated their alliance. The defenders on the other hand silently and grimly prepared for the inevitable escalation and war. The Jameson Raid alienated many Cape Afrikaners from the British, and united the Transvaal Boers behind President Kruger and his government. It also had the effect of drawing the Transvaal and the Orange Free State together in opposition to perceived British imperialism. In 1897, a military pact was concluded between the two republics. President Paul Kruger proceeded to re-equip the Transvaal Army, and imported 37,000 of the latest magazine Mauser rifles, and some 40 to 50 million rounds of ammunition. The best modern European artillery was also purchased. By October 1899 the Transvaal State Artillery had 73 guns, of which 59 were new, including 4 155mm Creusot Fortress guns, and 25 37mm Maxim Nordenfeldt guns. The Transvaal Army had been transformed. Approximately 25,000 men equipped with modern rifles and artillery could mobilize within 2 weeks. However, President Kruger's victory in the Jameson Raid incident did nothing to resolve the fundamental problem. The impossible dilemma continued, namely how to make concessions to the Witlanders without surrendering the independence of the Transvaal. The failure to gain improved rights for Witlanders became a pretext for war and a justification for a major military build-up in the Cape Colony. The case for war was developed and espoused as far away as the Australian colonies. Several key British colonial leaders favoured annexation of the independent Boer republics. These figures included Cape Colony Governor Sir Alfred Milner, Cape Prime Minister Cecil Rhodes, British Colonial Secretary Joseph Chamberlain, and mining syndicate owners or landlords, such as Alfred Bate, Barney Bonato, and Lionel Phillips. Confident that the Boers would be quickly defeated, he planned and organised a short war, citing the Witlanders' grievances as the motivation for the conflict. Their influence with the British government was, however, limited. Lord Salisbury, the Prime Minister, despised jingoism and jingoists. He also distrusted the abilities of the British Army. Yet he led Britain into war for 3 main reasons: because he believed the British government had an obligation to British South Africans, because he thought that the Transvaal, the Orange Free State, and the Cape Boers aspired to a Dutch South Africa, and that the achievement of such a state would damage Britain's imperial prestige around the world, and because of the Boers' treatment of black South Africans. Salisbury was not alone in this concern over the treatment of black South Africans. Roger Casement, already well on the way to becoming an Irish nationalist, was nevertheless happy to gather intelligence for the British against the Boers because of their treatment of black Africans. Given this sense of caution among key members of the British cabinet and of the army, it is even harder to understand why the British government went against the advice of its generals to send substantial reinforcements to South Africa before war broke out. One strong argument is that Lansdowne, Secretary of State for War, did not believe the Boers were preparing for war, and also believed that if Britain were to send large numbers of troops, It would strike too aggressive a posture and so prevent a negotiated settlement being reached or even encourage a Boer attack. President Steyn of the Orange Free State invited Milner and Kruger to attend a conference in Bloemfontein. The conference started on May 30, 1899, but negotiations quickly broke down, despite Kruger's offer of concessions. In September 1899, Chamberlain sent an ultimatum demanding full equality for British citizens resident in Transvaal. Kruger, seeing that war was inevitable, simultaneously issued his own ultimatum prior to receiving Chamberlain's. This gave the British 48 hours to withdraw all their troops from the border of Transvaal. Otherwise the Transvaal, allied with the Orange Free State, would declare war. News of the ultimatum reached London on the day it expired. Outrage and laughter were the main responses. The editor of the Times laughed out loud when he read it, saying an official document is seldom amusing and useful, yet this was both. The Times denounced the ultimatum as an extravagant farce. The Globe denounced this trumpery little state. Most editorials were similar to the Daily Telegraph, which declared, "Of course there can only be one answer to this grotesque challenge. Kruger has asked for war and war he must have." Such views were far from those of the British government, and from those in the army. To most sensible observers, army reform had been a matter of pressing concern from the 1870s, constantly put off because the British public did not want the expense of a larger, more professional army, and because a large home army was not politically welcome. Lord Salisbury, the Prime Minister, then had to explain to a surprised Queen Victoria that, "We have no army capable of meeting even a second-class continental power." First phase, the Boer Offensive, war was declared on October 11, 1899, with a Boer offensive into the British-held Natal and Cape Colony areas. The Boers had no problems with mobilization, since the fiercely independent Boers had no regular army units, apart from the artillery of both republics. As with the First Boer War, since the Boers were civilian militia, each man wore what he wished, usually his everyday dark grey, light grey, neutral-coloured, or earth-tone khaki farming clothes, often a jacket, trousers and slouch hat. Only the members of the artillery wore light green uniforms. When danger loomed, all the burghers in a district would form a military unit called a commando and would elect officers. A full-time official titled a veldknecht maintained muster rolls, but had no disciplinary powers. Each man brought his own weapon, usually a hunting rifle, and his own horse. Those who could not afford a gun were given one by the authorities. The presidents of the Transvaal and Orange Free State simply signed decrees to concentrate within a week, and the commandos could muster between 30,000 to 40,000 men. The average Boer nevertheless was not thirsty for war. Many did not look forward to fighting against fellow Christians and, by and large, fellow Christian Protestants. Many may have had an overly optimistic sense of what the war would involve, imagining that victory could be won as easily as in the First South African War. Many, including many generals, also had a sense that their cause was holy and just, and blessed by God. It rapidly became clear that the Boer forces presented the British forces with a severe tactical challenge. What the Boers presented was a mobile and innovative approach to warfare, drawing on their experiences from the First Boer War. The average Boers who made up their commandos were farmers who had spent almost all their working life in the saddle, both as farmers and hunters. They depended on the pot, horse and rifle, were skilled stalkers and marksmen. As hunters they had learned to fire from cover, from a prone position, and to make the first shot count, knowing that if they missed, the game would either be long gone or could charge and potentially kill them. At community gatherings, target shooting was a major sport, and they practiced shooting at targets such as hens' eggs perched on posts 100 meters away. They made expert mounted infantry, using every scrap of cover, from which they could pour in a destructive fire using their modern, smokeless, Mauser rifles. Furthermore, in preparation for hostilities, the Boers had acquired around 100 of the latest Krupp field guns, all horse-drawn and dispersed among the various commander groups, and several Lacreus at long-tom siege guns. The Boers' skill in adapting themselves to becoming first-rate artillerymen shows them to have been a versatile adversary. The Transvaal also had an intelligence service that stretched across South Africa, and of whose extent and efficiency the British were unaware. The Boers struck first on October 12 at Kruger, an attack that heralded the invasion of the Cape Colony and Colony of Natal between October 1899 and January 1900. With elements of both speed and surprise, the Boer drove quickly towards the major British garrison at Ladysmith and the smaller ones at Mafeking and Kimberley. The quick Boer mobilization resulted in early military successes against the scattered British forces. Sir George Stuart White, commanding the British division at Ladysmith, had unwisely allowed Major General Penn Simmons to throw a brigade forward to the coal mining town of Dundee, which was surrounded by hills. This became the site of the first engagement of the war, the Battle of Tulana Hill. Boer guns began shelling the British camp from the summit of Tulana Hill at dawn on October 20. Penn Simmons immediately counter-attacked. His infantry drove the Boers from the hill, but at the cost of 446 British casualties including Penn Simmons himself. Another Boer force occupied Elandslucht, which lay between Ladysmith and Dundee. The British under Major General John French and Colonel Ian Hamilton attacked to clear the line of communications to Dundee. The resulting Battle of Elandslucht was a clear-cut British tactical victory, but Sir George White feared that more Boers were about to attack his main position and ordered a chaotic retreat from Elandslucht, throwing away any advantage gained. The detachment from Dundee was compelled to make an exhausting cross-country retreat to rejoin White's main force. As Boers surrounded Ladysmith and opened fire on the town with siege guns, White ordered a major sortie against the Boer artillery positions. The result was a disaster, with 140 men killed and over 1,000 captured. The siege of Ladysmith began, and was to last several months. Meanwhile, to the northwest at Mafeking, on the border with Transvaal, Colonel Robert Baden-Powell had raised 2 regiments of local forces amounting to some 1,200 men in order to attack and create diversions if things further south went amiss. Mafeking, being a railway junction, provided good supply facilities and was the obvious place for Baden-Powell to fortify in readiness for such attacks. However, instead of being the aggressor, Baden-Powell and Mafeking were forced to defend when 6,000 Boer, commanded by Piet Cronje, attempted a determined assault on the town. But this quickly subsided into a desultory affair with the Boers prepared to starve the stronghold into submission, and so, on October 13, began the 217-day siege of Mafeking. Lastly, over 360 kilometers to the south of Mafeking lay the diamond mining city of Kimberley, which was also subjected to a siege. Although not militarily significant, it nonetheless represented an enclave of British imperialism on the borders of the Orange Free State and was hence an important Boer objective. From early November about 7,500 Boer began their siege, again content to starve the town into submission. Despite Boer shelling, the 40,000 inhabitants, of which only 5,000 were armed, were under little threat as the town was well stocked with provisions. The garrison was commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Robert Kekwich, although Cecil Rhodes was also a prominent figure in the defense. Siege life took its toll on both the defending soldiers and the civilians in the cities of Mafeking, Ladysmith, and Kimberley as food began to grow scarce after a few weeks. In Mafeking, Sol Plaatje wrote, "I saw horse flesh for the first time being treated as a human foodstuff." The cities under siege also dealt with constant artillery bombardment, making the streets a dangerous place. Near the end of the siege of Kimberley, it was expected that the Boers would intensify their bombardment, so Rhodes displayed a notice encouraging people to go down into shafts of the Kimberley mine for protection. The townspeople panicked, and people surged into the mine shafts constantly for a 12-hour period. Although the bombardment never came, this did nothing to diminish the distress of the civilians. The most well-heeled of the townspeople, such as Cecil Rhodes, sheltered in the sanatorium, site of the present-day McGregor Museum. The poorer residents, notably the black population, did not have any shelter from the shelling. In retrospect, the Boer decision to commit themselves to sieges was a mistake, and one of the best illustrations of the Boers' lack of strategic vision. Historically, it had little in its favor. Of the 7 sieges in the First Boer War, the Boers had won none. More importantly, it handed the initiative back to the British and allowed them time to recover, which they then did. Generally speaking, throughout the campaign, the Boers were too defensive and passive, wasting the opportunities they had for victory. Yet that passiveness also testified to the fact that they had no desire to conquer British territory, but only to preserve their ability to rule in their own territory. First British relief attempts. It was at this point that General Sir Ridvers Henry Buller, a much-respected commander, arrived in South Africa with major British reinforcements. Buller originally intended an offensive straight up the railway line leading from Cape Town through Bloemfontein to Pretoria. Finding on arrival that the British troops already in South Africa were under siege, he split his army corps into several widely spread detachments, to relieve the besieged garrisons. One division, led by Lieutenant General Lord Methuen, was to follow the Western Railway to the north and relieve Kimberley and Mafeking. A smaller force of about 3,000 led by Major General William Gattaker, was to push north toward the railway junction at Stormberg, to secure the Cape Midlands district from Boer raids and local rebellions by Boer inhabitants. Finally, Buller himself would lead the major part of the Army Corps to relieve Ladysmith to the east. The initial results of this offensive were mixed, with Methuen winning several bloody skirmishes at Belmont on November 23, at Graspan on November 25, and at a larger conflict, Modder River on November 28, resulting in British losses of 71 dead and over 400 wounded. British commanders had trained on the lessons of the Crimean War, and were adept at battalion and regimental set pieces with columns maneuvering in jungles, deserts and mountainous regions. What they entirely failed to comprehend, however, was both the impact of destructive fire from trench positions and the mobility of cavalry raids, both of which had been developed in the American Civil War. The British troops went to war with what would prove to be antiquated tactics, and in some cases antiquated weapons, against the mobile Boer forces with the destructive fire of their modern Morsers, the latest Krupp field guns, and their innovative tactics. The middle of December was disastrous for the British Army. In a period known as Black Week, the British suffered a series of losses on each of the three major fronts. On December 10, General Gattaker tried to recapture Stormberg Railway Junction about 50 miles south of the Orange River. Gattaker's attack was marked by administrative and tactical blunders, and the Battle of Stormberg ended in a British defeat, with 135 killed and wounded, and 2 guns and over 600 troops captured. At the Battle of Majesfontein on December 11, Methuen's 14,000 British troops attempted to capture a Boer position in a dawn attack to relieve Kimberley. This too turned into a disaster when the Highland Brigade became pinned down by accurate Boer fire. After suffering from intense heat and thirst for 9 hours, they eventually broke an ill-disciplined retreat. The Boer commanders, Koos de la Rey and Piet Kranjar Copyright, had ordered trenches to be dug in an unconventional place to fool the British and to give their riflemen a greater firing range. The plan worked, and this tactic helped write the doctrine of the supremacy of the defensive position, using modern small arms and trench fortifications. The British lost 120 killed and 690 wounded and were prevented from relieving Kimberley and Mafeking. A British soldier encapsulated the soldiers' view of the defeat. Such was the day for our regiment, dread the revenge we will take. Dearly we paid for the blunder, a drawing room general's mistake. Why weren't we told of the trenches? Why weren't we told of the wire? Why were we marched up in column, may Tommy Atkins enquirer. However, the nadir of Black Week was the Battle of Colenso on December 15, where 21,000 British troops commanded by Buller himself, attempted to cross the Tugela River to relieve Ladysmith, where 8,000 Transvaal Boers, under the command of Louis Botha, were awaiting them. Through a combination of artillery and accurate rifle fire, and a better use of the ground, the Boers repelled all British attempts to cross the river. After his first attacks failed, Buller broke off the battle and ordered a retreat, abandoning many wounded men, several isolated units and 10 field guns to be captured by Botha's men. Buller's forces lost 145 men killed and 1,200 missing or wounded. The Boers suffered 40 casualties, including only 8 killed. Second phase, the British offensive of January to September 1900. The British government took these defeats badly and with the sieges still continuing was compelled to send 2 more divisions plus large numbers of colonial volunteers. By January 1900 this would become the largest force Britain had ever sent overseas, amounting to some 180,000 men with further reinforcements being sought. While watching for these reinforcements, Buller made another bid to relieve Ladysmith by crossing the Tugela west of Colenso. Buller's subordinate, Major General Charles Warren, successfully crossed the river, but was then faced with a fresh defensive position centered on a prominent hill known as Spion Kop. In the resulting Battle of Spion Kop, British troops captured the summit by surprise during the early hours of January 24, 1900, but as the early morning fog lifted they realized too late that they were overlooked by Bourgogne emplacements on the surrounding hills. The rest of the day resulted in a disaster caused by poor communication between Buller and his commanders. Between them they issued contradictory orders, on the one hand ordering men off the hill, while other officers ordered fresh reinforcements to defend it. The result was 350 men killed and nearly 1,000 wounded and a retreat back across the Tugela River into British territory. There were nearly 300 Boer casualties. Buller attacked Louis Botha again on February 5 at Valkrans and was again defeated. Buller withdrew early when it appeared that the British would be isolated in an exposed bridgehead across the Tugela, and was nicknamed Sir Reverse by some of his officers. By taking command in person in Natal, Buller had allowed the overall direction of the war to drift. Because of concerns about his performance and negative reports from the field, he was replaced as Commander-in-Chief by Field Marshal Lord Roberts. Roberts quickly assembled an entirely new team for headquarters staff and he chose military men from far and wide, Lord Kitchener from the Sudan, Frederick Russell Burnham, the American scout, from the Klondike, David Henderson from the Staff College, Neville Bowles Chamberlain from Afghanistan, and William Nicholson from Calcutta. Like Buller, Roberts first intended to attack directly along the Cape Town-Pretoria Railway but, again like Buller, was forced to relieve the beleaguered garrisons. Leaving Buller in command in Natal, Roberts massed his main force near the Orange River and along the Western Railway behind Methuen's force at the Modder River, and prepared to make a wide outflanking move to relieve Kimberley. Except in Natal, the war had stagnated. Other than a single attempt to storm Ladysmith, the Boers made no attempt to capture the besieged towns. In the Cape Midlands, the Boers did not exploit the British defeat at Stormberg, and were prevented from capturing the railway junction at Collisburg. In the dry summer, the grazing on the veldt became parched, weakening the Boers' horses and draft oxen, and many Boer families joined their menfolk in the siege lines and lineages, fatally encumbering Cronje's army. Roberts launched his main attack on February 10, 1900 and although hampered by a long supply route, managed to outflank the Boers defending Magersfontein. On February 14, a cavalry division under Major General John French launched a major attack to relieve Kimberley. Although encountering severe fire, a massed cavalry charge split the Boer defences on February 15, opening the way for French to enter Kimberley that evening, ending its 124-day siege. Meanwhile, Roberts pursued Piet Cronje's 7,000-strong force, which had abandoned Magersfontein to head for Bloemfontein. General French's cavalry was ordered to assist in the pursuit by embarking on an epic 30-mile drive towards Paardeberg where Cronje was attempting to cross the Modder River. At the Battle of Paardeberg from 18 to February 27, Roberts then surrounded General Piet Cronje's retreating Boer army. On February 17, a pincer movement involving both French's cavalry and the main British force attempted to take the entrenched position, but the frontal attacks were uncoordinated and so were easily repulsed by the Boers. Finally, Roberts resorted to bombarding Cronje into submission, but it took a further 10 precious days and with the British troops using the polluted Modder River as water supply, resulting in a typhoid epidemic killing many troops. General Cronje was forced to surrender at Surrender Hill with 4,000 men. In Natal, the Battle of the Tugela Heights, which started on February 14, was Buller's fourth attempt to relieve Ladysmith. Despite reinforcements his progress was painfully slow against stiff opposition. However, on February 26, after much deliberation, Buller used all his forces in one all-out attacks for the first time and at last succeeded in forcing a crossing of the Tugela, and defeated both his outnumbered forces north of Colenso. After a siege lasting 118 days, the relief of Ladysmith was effected, the day after Cronje surrendered, but at a total cost of 7,000 British casualties. After a succession of defeats, the Boers realized that against such overwhelming superiority of troops, they had little chance of defeating the British and so became demoralized. Roberts then advanced into the Orange Free State from the west, putting the Boers to flight at the Battle of Poplar Grove and capturing Bloemfontein, the capital, unopposed on March 13 with the Boer defenders escaping and scattering. Meanwhile, he detached a small force to relieve Baden-Powell, and the relief of Mafeking on May 18, 1900 provoked riotous celebrations in Britain. On May 28, the Orange Free State was annexed and renamed the Orange River Colony. After being forced to delay for several weeks at Bloemfontein due to a shortage of supplies and enteric fever, caused by poor hygiene, drinking bad water at Paardeberg and appalling medical care, Roberts resumed his advance. He was forced to halt again at Kroonstad for 10 days, due once again to the collapse of his medical and supply systems, but finally captured Johannesburg on May 31 and the capital of the Transvaal, Pretoria, on June 5. The first into Pretoria was Lieutenant William Watson of the New South Wales Mounted Rifles, who persuaded the Boers to surrender the capital. This allowed Roberts to declare the war over, having won the principal cities, and so, on September 3, 1900, the South African Republic was formally annexed. British observers believed the war to be all but over after the capture of the two capital cities. However, the Boers had earlier met at the temporary new capital of the Orange Free State, Kroonstad, and planned a guerrilla campaign to hit the British supply and communication lines. The first engagement of this new form of warfare was at Sanna's Post on March 31, where 1,500 Boers under the command of Christian de Wet attacked Bloemfontein's waterworks about 23 miles east of the city, and ambushed a heavily escorted convoy, which caused 155 British casualties and the capture of 7 guns, 117 wagons, and 428 British troops. After the fall of Pretoria, one of the last formal battles was at Diamond Hill on June 12, where Roberts attempted to drive the remnants of the Boer Field Army beyond striking distance of Pretoria. Although Roberts drove the Boers from the hill, the Boer commander, Louis Botha, did not regard it as a defeat, for he inflicted more casualties on the British while suffering around 50 casualties. The set-piece period of the war now largely gave way to a mobile guerrilla war, but one final operation remained. President Kruger and what remained of the Transvaal government had retreated to eastern Transvaal. Roberts, joined by troops from Natal under Buller, advanced against them, and broke their last defensive position at Bergendal on August 26. As Roberts and Buller followed up along the railway line to Komatipoort, Kruger sought asylum in Portuguese East Africa. Some dispirited Boers did likewise, and the British gathered up much war material. However, the core of the Boer fighters under Botha easily broke back through the Drakensberg Mountains into the Transvaal Hickveld after riding north through the Bushveld. Under the new conditions of the war, heavy equipment was no use to them, and therefore no great loss. As Roberts's army occupied Pretoria, the Boer fighters in the Orange Free State had been driven into a fertile area known as the Brandwater Basin in the northeast of the Republic. This offered only temporary sanctuary, as the mountain passes leading to it could be occupied by the British, trapping the Boers. A force under General Archibald Hunter set out from Bloemfontein to achieve this in July 1900. The hardcore of the Free State Boers under Christian de Wet, accompanied by President Steyn, left the basin early. Those remaining fell into confusion and most failed to break out before Hunter trapped them. 4,500 Boers surrendered and much equipment was captured, but as with Roberts's drive against Kruger at the same time, these losses were of relatively little consequence, as the hardcore of the Boer armies and their most determined and active leaders remained at large. From the basin, Christian de Wet headed west. Although hounded by British columns, he succeeded in crossing the Vaal into western Transvaal, to allow Steen to travel to meet the Transvaal leaders. There was much sympathy for the Boers on mainland Europe, and in October, President Kruger and members of the Transvaal government left Portuguese East Africa on the Dutch warship De Gelderland, sent by the Queen of the Netherlands Wilhelmina, who had simply ignored the British naval blockade of South Africa. Paul Kruger's wife, however, was too ill to travel and remained in South Africa, where she died on July 20, 1901, without seeing her husband again. President Kruger first went to Marseille and then on to the Netherlands, where he stayed for a while before moving finally to Clarens, Switzerland, where he died in exile on July 14, 1904. POWs sent overseas. The first sizable batch of Boer prisoners of war taken by the British consisted of those captured at the Battle of Elandslucht on October 21, 1899. At first, many were put on ships, but as numbers grew, the British decided they did not want them kept locally. The capture of 400 POWs in February 1900 was a key event, which made the British realise they could not accommodate all POWs in South Africa. The British feared they could be freed by sympathetic locals. Moreover, they already had trouble supplying their own troops in South Africa, and did not want the added burden of sending supplies for the POWs. Britain therefore chose to send many POWs overseas. The first overseas camps were opened in St. Helena, which ultimately received about 5,000 POWs. About 5,000 POWs were sent to Ceylon. Other POWs were sent to Bermuda and India. No evidence exists of Boer POWs being sent to the dominions of the British Empire such as Australia, Canada or New Zealand. In all, about 26,000 POWs were sent overseas. Third phase, Guerrilla War. By September 1900, the British were nominally in control of both republics, with the exception of the northern part of Transvaal. However, they soon discovered that they only controlled the territory their columns physically occupied. Despite the loss of their two capital cities and half of their army, the Boer commanders adopted guerrilla warfare tactics, primarily conducting raids against infrastructure, resource and supply targets, all aimed at disrupting the operational capacity of the British Army. Each Boer commando unit was sent to the district from which its members had been recruited, which meant that they could rely on local support and personal knowledge of the terrain and the towns within the district, thereby enabling them to live off the land. Their orders were simply to act against the British whenever possible. Their tactics were to strike fast and hard, causing as much damage to the enemy as possible, and then to withdraw and vanish before enemy reinforcements could arrive. The vast distances of the republics allowed the Boer commandos considerable freedom to move about and made it nearly impossible for the 250,000 British troops to control the territory effectively using columns alone. As soon as a British column left a town or district, British control of that area faded away. The Boer commandos were especially effective during the initial guerrilla phase of the war because Roberts had assumed that the war would end with the capture of the Boer capitals and the dispersal of the main Boer armies. Many British troops were therefore redeployed out of the area, and had been replaced by lower-quality contingents of Imperial Yeomanry and locally raised irregular corps. From late May 1900, the first successes of the Boer strategy were at Lindley, and at Heilbronn, and other skirmishes resulting in 1,500 British casualties in less than 10 days. In December 1900, de Lauret and Christian besmouled a British brigade at Nieuw Geducht. As a result of these and other Boer successes, the British, led by Lord Kitchener, mounted 3 extensive searches for De Wet, but without success. However, by the very nature of the Boer guerrilla war was sporadic, poorly planned, and with little overall objective in mind except to harass the British. This led to a disorganized pattern of scattered engagements throughout the region. British response: the British were forced to quickly revise their tactics. They concentrated on restricting the freedom of movement of the Boer commandos and depriving them of local support. The railway lines had provided vital lines of communication and supply, and as the British had advanced across South Africa, they had used armoured trains and had established fortified blockhouses at key points. They now built additional blockhouses and fortified these to protect supply routes against Boer raiders. Eventually some 8,000 such blockhouses were built across the 2 South African republics, radiating from the larger towns. Each blockhouse cost between £800 to £1,000 and took about 3 months to build. However, they proved very effective. Not one bridge where one of these blockhouses was sited and manned was blown. The blockhouse system required an enormous number of troops to maintain. Well over 50,000 British troops, or 50 battalions, were involved in blockhouse duty, greater than the approximately 30,000 Boers in the field during the guerrilla phase. In addition, up to 16,000 Africans were used both as armed guards and to patrol the line at night. The army linked the blockhouses with barbed wire fences to parcel up the wide veldt into smaller areas. New model drives were mounted under which a continuous line of troops could sweep an area of veldt bounded by blockhouse lines, unlike the earlier inefficient scouring of the countryside by scattered columns. The British also implemented a scorched earth policy under which they targeted everything within the controlled areas that could give sustenance to the Boer guerrillas with a view to making it harder and harder for the Boers to survive. As British troops swept the countryside, they systematically destroyed crops, burned homesteads and farms, poisoned wells, and interned Boer and African women, children and workers in concentration camps. Finally, the British also established their own mounted raiding columns in support of the sweeper columns. These were used to rapidly follow and relentlessly harass the Boers with a view to delaying them and cutting off escape, while the sweeper units caught up. Many of the 90 or so mobile columns formed by the British to participate in such drives were a mixture of British and colonial troops, but they also had a large minority of armed Africans. The total number of armed Africans serving with these columns has been estimated at approximately 20,000. The British Army also made use of Boer auxiliaries who had been persuaded to change sides and enlist as National Scouts. Serving under the command of General Andries Kronje, the National Scouts were despised as hensoppers but came to number a fifth of the fighting Afrikaners by the end of the war. The British utilised armoured trains throughout the war to deliver rapid reaction forces much more quickly to incidents or to drop them off ahead of retreating Boer columns. The Orange Free State. After having conferred with the Transvaal leaders, De Wet returned to the Orange Free State, where he inspired a series of successful attacks and raids from the hitherto quiet western part of the country, though he suffered a rare defeat at Bothaville in November 1900. Many Boers who had earlier returned to their farms, sometimes giving formal parole to the British, took up arms again. In late January 1901, De Wet led a renewed invasion of Cape Colony. This was less successful, because there was no general uprising among the Cape Boers, and De Wet's men were hampered by bad weather and relentlessly pursued by British forces. They narrowly escaped across the Orange River. From then until the final days of the war, De Wet remained comparatively quiet, partly because the Orange Free State was effectively left desolate by British sweeps. In late 1901, De Wet overran an isolated British detachment at Grunkop, inflicting heavy casualties. This prompted Kitchener to launch the first of the new model drives against him. De Wet escaped the first such drive, but lost 300 of his fighters. This was a severe loss, and a portent of further attrition, although the subsequent attempts to round up De Wet were badly handled, and De Wet's forces avoided capture. Western Transvaal. The Boer commandos in the Western Transvaal were very active after September 1901. Several battles of importance were fought here between September 1901 and March 1902. At Modeville on September 30, 1901 and again at Driefontein on October 24, General Koos de Lore's forces attacked the British, but were forced to withdraw after the British offered strong resistance. A time of relative quiet descended thereafter on the Western Transvaal. February 1902 saw the next major battle in that region. On February 25, Koos de Lore attacked a British column under Lieutenant Colonel S. B. von Donop at Istersproot near Wolmaranstad. De Lore succeeded in capturing many men and a large amount of ammunition. The Boer attacks prompted Lord Methuen, the British second-in-command after Lord Kitchener, to move his column from Vryburg to Krugsdorp to deal with de Lore. On the morning of March 7, 1902, the Boers attacked the rearguard of Methuen's moving column at Tweebosch. Confusion reigned in British ranks and Methuen was wounded and captured by the Boers. The Boer victories in the west led to stronger action by the British. In the second half of March 1902, large British reinforcements were sent to the western Transvaal under the direction of Ian Hamilton. The opportunity the British were waiting for arose on April 11, 1902 at Rooiwal, where a commando led by General Jan Kemp and Commandant Potgieter attacked a superior force under Kekwich. The British soldiers were well positioned on the hillside and inflicted severe casualties on the Boers charging on horseback over a large distance, beating them back. This was the end of the war in the Western Transvaal and also the last major battle of the war. Eastern Transvaal, 2 Boer forces fought in this area, one under Botha in the southeast and a second under Ben Viljoen in the northeast around Lydenburg. Botha's forces were particularly active, raiding railways and British supply convoys, and even mounting a renewed invasion of Natal in September, 1901. After defeating British mounted infantry in the Battle of Blood River Post near Dundee, Botha was forced to withdraw by heavy rains that made movement difficult and crippled his horses. Back on the Transvaal territory around his home district of Heerd, Botha attacked a British raiding column at Bakenlugt, using an effective mounted charge. One of the most active British units was effectively destroyed in this engagement. This made Botha's forces the target of increasingly large and ruthless drives by British forces, in which the British made particular use of native scouts and informers. Eventually, Botha had to abandon the high veld and retreat to a narrow enclave bordering Swaziland. To the north, Ben Viljoen grew steadily less active. His forces mounted comparatively few attacks and as a result, the Boer enclave around Lydenburg was largely unmolested. Viljoen was eventually captured. Cape Colony, in parts of Cape Colony, particularly the Cape Midlands district where Boers formed a majority of the white inhabitants, the British had always feared a general uprising against them. In fact, no such uprising took place, even in the early days of the war when Boer armies had advanced across the Orange. The cautious conduct of some of the elderly Orange Free State generals had been one factor that discouraged the Cape Boers from siding with the Boer republics. Nevertheless, there was widespread pro-Boer sympathy. After he escaped across the Orange in March 1901, De Wet had left forces under Cape rebels Kritzinger and Scheepers to maintain a guerrilla campaign in the Cape Midlands. The campaign here was one of the least chivalrous of the war, with intimidation by both sides of each other's civilian sympathizers. In one of many skirmishes, Commandant Lottier's small commando was tracked down by a much superior British column and wiped out at Grumkloof. Several captured rebels, including Lottier and Scheepers, who was captured when he fell ill with appendicitis, were executed by the British for treason or for capital crimes such as the murder of prisoners or of unarmed civilians. Some of the executions took place in public, to deter further disaffection. Since the Cape Colony was imperial territory, its authorities forbade the British Army to burn farms or to force Boers into concentration camps. Fresh Boer forces under Jan Crissy and Smarts, joined by the surviving rebels under Kritzinger, made another attack on the Cape in September 1901. They suffered severe hardships and were hard-pressed by British columns, but eventually rescued themselves by routing some of their pursuers at the Battle of Elands River and capturing their equipment. From then until the end of the war, Smarts increased his forces from among Cape rebels until they numbered 3,000. However, no general uprising took place, and the situation in the Cape remained stalemated. In January 1902, Boer leader Manie Maritz was implicated in the Leliefontein massacre in the far northern Cape. Surgery and medicine during the war. More than half of British casualties during the war were caused by illness, especially typhoid fever, rather than enemy action. Concentration camps. Media related to Second Boer War concentration camps at Wikimedia Commons. The term concentration camp was used to describe camps operated by the British in South Africa during this conflict, and the term grew in prominence during this period. The camps had originally been set up by the British Army as refugee camps to provide refuge for civilian families who had been forced to abandon their homes for whatever reason related to the war. However, when Kitchener succeeded Roberts as Commander-in-Chief in South Africa on November 29, 1900, the British Army introduced new tactics in an attempt to break the guerrilla campaign, and the influx of civilians grew dramatically as a result. Kitchener initiated plans to flush out guerrillas in a series of systematic drives, organised like a sporting shoot, with success defined in a weekly bag of killed, captured and wounded, and to sweep the country bare of everything that could give sustenance to the guerrillas, including women and children. It was the clearance of civilians uprooting a whole nation that would come to dominate the last phase of the war. As Boer farms were destroyed by the British under their scorched earth policy including the systematic destruction of crops and slaughtering of livestock, the burning down of homesteads and farms, and the poisoning of wells and salting of fields to prevent the Boers from resupplying from a home base, many tens of thousands of women and children were forcibly moved into the concentration camps. This was not the first appearance of internment camps. The Spanish had used internment in the 10 Years' War that led to the Spanish-American War, and the United States had used them to devastate guerrilla forces during the Philippine-American War. But the Boer War concentration camp system was the first time that a whole nation had been systematically targeted, and the first in which some whole regions had been depopulated. Eventually, there were a total of 45 tented camps built for Boer internees and 64 for black Africans. Of the 28,000 Boer men captured as prisoners of war, 25,630 were sent overseas. The vast majority of Boers remaining in the local camps were women and children. Over 26,000 women and children were to perish in these concentration camps. The camps were poorly administered from the outset and became increasingly overcrowded when Kitchener's troops implemented the internment strategy on a vast scale. Conditions were terrible for the health of the internees, mainly due to neglect, poor hygiene and bad sanitation. The supply of all items was unreliable, partly because of the constant disruption of communication lines by the Boers. The food rations were meagre and there was a two-tier allocation policy, whereby families of men who were still fighting were routinely given smaller rations than others. The inadequate shelter, poor diet, inadequate hygiene and overcrowding led to malnutrition and endemic contagious diseases such as measles, typhoid and dysentery, to which the children were particularly vulnerable. An additional problem was the Boers' use of traditional medicines like a cow dung poultice for skin diseases and crushed insects for convulsions. Coupled with a shortage of modern medical facilities, many of the internees died. As the war raged across, their farms and their homes were destroyed, many Africans became refugees and they, like the Boers, moved to the towns where the British Army hastily created internment camps. Subsequently, the scorched earth policy was ruthlessly applied to both Boers and Africans. Although most black Africans were not considered by the British to be hostile, many tens of thousands were also forcibly removed from Boer areas and also placed in concentration camps. Africans were held separately from Boer internees. Eventually there were a total of 64 tented camps for Africans. Conditions were as bad as in the camps for the Boers, but even though, after the Forrest Commission report, conditions improved in the Boer camps, improvements were much slower in coming to the black camps. Public opinion and political opposition. Although the 1900 UK general election, also known as the khaki election, had resulted in a victory for the Conservative government on the back of recent British victories against the Boers, public support quickly waned as it became apparent that the war would not be easy, and further unease developed following reports about the treatment by the British Army of the Boer civilians. Public and political opposition to government policies in South Africa regarding Boer civilians was first expressed in Parliament in February 1901 in the form of an attack on the policy, the government, and the army by the radical Liberal MP David Lloyd George. Emily Hobhouse, a delegate of the South African Women and Children's Distress Fund, visited some of the camps in the Orange Free State from January 1901, and in May 1901 she returned to England on board the ship, the Saxon. Alfred Milner, High Commissioner in South Africa, also boarded the Saxon for holiday in England, but, unfortunately for both the camp internees and the British government, he had no time for Miss Hobhouse, regarding her as a Boer sympathiser and troublemaker. On her return, Emily Hobhouse did much to publicise the distress of the camp inmates. She managed to speak to the Liberal Party leader, Henry Campbell Bannerman, who professed to be suitably outraged but was disinclined to press the matter, as his party was split between the imperialists and the pro-Boer factions. The more radical liberals, however, such as David Lloyd George and John Ellis, were prepared to raise the matter in Parliament and to harass the government on the issue, which they duly did. St. John Broderick, the Conservative Secretary of State for War, first defended the government's policy by arguing that the camps were purely voluntary, and that the interned Boers were contented and comfortable, but was somewhat undermined as he had no firm statistics to back up his argument, so when his voluntary argument proved untenable, he resorted to the military necessity argument and stated that everything possible was being done to ensure satisfactory conditions in the camps. Hobhouse published a report in June, 1901 that contradicted Broderick's claim, and Lloyd George then openly accused the government of a policy of extermination directed against the Boer population. In June, 1901, Liberal opposition party leader Campbell Bannerman took up the assault and answered the rhetorical question, when is a war not a war? With his own rhetorical answer, when it is carried on by methods of barbarism in South Africa, referring to those same camps and the policies that created them. The Hobhouse report caused uproar both domestically and in the international community. However, there was very little public sympathy for the highly reactionary Boer President Kruger. The Forsyth Commission, although the government had comfortably won the parliamentary debate by a margin of 252 to 149, it was stung by the criticism and concerned by the escalating public outcry, and called on Kitchener for a detailed report. In response, complete statistical returns from camps were sent in July 1901. By August 1901, it was clear to government and opposition alike that Miss Hobhouse's worst fears were being confirmed. €93,940 Boers and 24,457 black Africans were reported to be in camps of refuge, and the crisis was becoming a catastrophe as the death rates appeared very high, especially among the children. The government responded to the growing clamour by appointing a commission. The Forsyth Commission, as it became known, was, uniquely for its time, an all-woman affair headed by Millicent Fawcett, who despite being the leader of the women's suffrage movement was a liberal unionist and thus a government supporter and considered a safe pair of hands. Between August and December, 1901, the Forsyth Commission conducted its own tour of the camps in South Africa. While it is probable that the British government expected the Commission to produce a report that could be used to fend off criticism, in the end it confirmed everything that Emily Hobhouse had said. Indeed, if anything, the Commission's recommendations went even further. The Commission insisted that rations should be increased and that additional nurses be sent out immediately, and included a long list of other practical measures designed to improve conditions in the camp. Millicent Fawcett was quite blunt in expressing her opinion that much of the catastrophe was owed to a simple failure to observe elementary rules of hygiene. In November 1901, the Colonial Secretary Joseph Chamberlain ordered Alfred Milner to ensure that all possible steps are being taken to reduce the rate of mortality. The civil authority took over the running of the camps from Kitchener and the British command, and by February 1902 the annual death rate in the concentration camps for white inmates dropped to 6.9% and eventually to 2%, which was a lower rate than pertained in many British cities at the time. However, by then the damage had been done. A report after the war concluded that 27,927 Boers had died of starvation, disease and exposure in the concentration camps. In all, about 1 in 4 of the Boer inmates, mostly children, died. Improvements, however, were much slower in coming to the black camps. It is thought that about 12% of black African inmates died, but the precise number of deaths of black Africans in concentration camps is unknown, as little attempt was made to keep any records of the 107,000 black Africans who were interned. The main decisions had been left to the soldiers, to whom the life or death of the 154,000 Boer and African civilians in the camps rated as an abysmally low priority. It was only 10 months after the subject had first been raised in Parliament, and after public outcry and after the Forsyth Commission, that remedial action was taken, and the terrible mortality figures were at last declining. In the interval, at least 20,000 whites and 12,000 coloured people had died in the concentration camps. the majority from epidemics of measles and typhoid that could have been avoided. Somewhat higher figures for total deaths in the concentration camps are given by SB spies. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle had served as a volunteer doctor in the Langman Field Hospital at Bloemfontein between March and June 1900. In his widely distributed and translated pamphlet The War in South Africa, Its Cause and Conduct, he justified both the causes of the war and its conduct. He also pointed out that over 14,000 British soldiers had died of disease during the conflict, and at the height of epidemics he was seeing 60 British soldiers dying each day in a single ill-equipped and overwhelmed military hospital. Kitchener's policy in the post-war debate, it has been argued that this was not a deliberately genocidal policy. Rather it was the result of, a disastrous lack of foresight and rank incompetence on the part of the British military. British historian Niall Ferguson also argues that Kitchener no more desired the deaths of women and children in the camps than of the wounded dervishes after Omdurman, or of his own soldiers in the typhoid-stricken hospitals of Bloemfontein. It seems that Milner as well the British government were early aware of the death rates in these camps. The main concern was the resulting public image and, however, to Kitchener and the British command, the life or death of the 154,000 Boer and African civilians in the camps rated as an abysmally low priority against military objectives. As the Forrest Commission was delivering its recommendations, Kitchener wrote to St John Broderick defending his policy of sweeps, and emphasising that no new Boer families were being brought in unless they were in danger of starving. This was disingenuous, as the countryside had by then been devastated under the scorched earth policy, and now that the new model counterinsurgency tactics were in full swing, it made cynical military sense to leave the Boer families in desperate conditions in the countryside. According to writer S.B. Spies, at the Vereeniging negotiations in May 1902, Boer leader Louis Botha stated that he had tried to send Boer families to the British, but they had refused to receive them. Spies quotes a Boer commandant referring to Boer women and children made refugees by Britain's scorched earth policy as saying, "Our families are in a pitiable condition and the enemy uses those families to force us to surrender." Spies adds, and there is little doubt that that was indeed the intention of Kitchener when he had issued instructions that no more families were to be brought into the concentration camps. Thomas Pakenham writes of Kitchener's policy U-turn. No doubt the continued hullabaloo at the death rate in these concentration camps, and Milner's belated agreement to take over their administration, helped change Kitchener's mind, sometime at the end of 1901, By mid-December at any rate, Kitchener was already circulating all column commanders with instructions not to bring in women and children when they cleared the country, but to leave them with the guerrillas. Viewed as a gesture to Liberals, on the eve of the new session of Parliament at Westminster, it was a shrewd political move. It also made excellent military sense, as it greatly handicapped the guerrillas, now that the drives were in full swing. It was effective precisely because, contrary to the Liberals' convictions, it was less humane than bringing them into camps, though this was of no great concern to Kitchener. Towards the end of the war, British tactics of containment, denial, and harassment began to yield results against the guerrillas. The sourcing and coordination of intelligence became increasingly efficient, with regular reporting from observers in the blockhouses, from units patrolling the fences and conducting sweeper operations, and from native Africans in rural areas who increasingly supplied intelligence, as the scorched earth policy took effect and they found themselves competing with the Boers for food supplies. Kitchener's forces at last began to seriously affect the Boers' fighting strength and freedom of maneuver, and made it harder for the Boers and their families to survive. The Boers and the British both feared the consequences of arming Africans. The memories of the Zulu and other tribal conflicts were still fresh, and they recognized that whoever won would have to deal with the consequences of a mass militarization of the tribes. There was therefore an unwritten agreement that this war would be a white man's war. At the outset, British officials instructed all white magistrates in the Natal colony to appeal to Zulu Armakosi to remain neutral, and President Kruger sent emissaries asking them to stay out of it. However, in some cases there were old scores to be settled, and some Africans, such as the Swazis, were eager to enter the war with the specific aim of reclaiming land confiscated by the Boers. As the war went on, there was greater involvement of Africans, and in particular large numbers became embroiled in the conflict on the British side either voluntarily or involuntarily. By the end of the war, many blacks had been armed and had shown conspicuous gallantry in roles such as scouts, messengers, watchmen in blockhouses, and auxiliaries. And there were more flashpoints outside of the war. On May 6, 1902 at Hawkins in the southeastern Transvaal, a Zulu faction had their cattle stolen and their people mistreated by the Boers as a punishment for helping the British. The local Boer officer then sent an insulting message to the tribe, challenging them to take back their cattle. The Zulus attacked at night, and in a mutual bloodbath, the Boers lost 56 killed and 3 wounded, while the Africans suffered 52 killed and 48 wounded. The official statistics of blacks who had served as combatants or non-combatants or who died in the concentration camps are unreliable. Many black combatants were dumped in unmarked graves, and most of the superintendents of the concentration camps did not record the deaths of black inmates. After the war, the British government went to great lengths to attempt to conciliate Boer opinion to the extent of refusing to officially recognize the military contribution made by blacks by issuing campaign medals. It was felt that the Boers would already feel insecure and angry at the arming of blacks, and granting medals would have prejudiced the stability of the region. Boer insecurity and the British government's favouring of Boer over African interests caused much bitterness, and did much to shape the racial politics of the region. The British offered terms of peace on various occasions, notably in March, 1901, but were rejected by Botha. The last of the Boers surrendered in May, 1902, and the war ended with the Treaty of Vereeniging signed on May 31, 1902. Although the British had won, this came at a cost. The Boers were given £3 million for reconstruction and were promised eventual limited self-government, which was granted in 1906 and 1907. The treaty ended the existence of the South African Republic and the Orange Free State as independent Boer republics and placed them within the British Empire. The Union of South Africa was established as a member of the Commonwealth in 1910. In all, the war had cost around 75,000 lives. 22,000 British and Allied soldiers, between 6,000 and 7,000 Boer fighters, and, mainly in the concentration camps, between 20,000 to 28,000 Boer civilians and perhaps 20,000 black Africans. During the conflict, 78 Victoria Crosses, the highest and most prestigious award in the British Armed Forces for bravery in the face of the enemy, were awarded to British and colonial soldiers. See List of Boer War Victoria Cross recipients. Aftermath and analysis. The Second Boer War cast long shadows over the history of the South African region. The predominantly agrarian society of the former Boer republics was profoundly and fundamentally affected by the scorched earth policy of Roberts and Kitchener. The devastation of both Boer and black African populations in the concentration camps and through war and exile were to have a lasting effect on the demography and quality of life in the region. Many exiles and prisoners were unable to return to their farms at all. Others attempted to do so but were forced to abandon the farms as unworkable given the damage caused by farm burning and salting of the fields in the course of the scorched earth policy. Destitute Boers and black Africans swelled the ranks of the unskilled urban poor, competing with the Witlanders in the mines. The post-war Reconstruction administration was presided over by Lord Milner and his largely Oxford-trained Milner's Kindergarten. This small group of civil servants had a profound effect on the region, eventually leading to the Union of South Africa. In the aftermath of the war, an imperial administration freed from accountability to a domestic electorate set about reconstructing an economy that was by then predicated unambiguously on gold. At the same time, British civil servants, municipal officials, and their cultural adjuncts were hard at work in the heartland of the former Boer republics, helping to forge new identities, first as British South Africans and then, later still, as white South Africans. Some scholars, for good reasons, identify these new identities as partly underpinning the Act of Union that followed in 1910. Although challenged by a Boer rebellion only 4 years later, they did much to shape South African politics between the two world wars and right up to the present day. The counterinsurgency techniques and lessons learned during the Boer War were used by the British in future guerrilla campaigns, including to counter Malayan communist rebels during the Malayan Emergency. In World War II, the British also adopted some of the concepts of raiding from the Boer commandos when, after the fall of France, they set up their special raiding forces, and in acknowledgement of their erstwhile enemies, chose the name British Commandos. Many of the Boers referred to the war as the Second of the Freedom Wars. The most resistant of Boers wanted to continue the fight and were known as Bitterenders, and at the end of the war a number of Boer fighters such as Damies Wright chose exile rather than sign an oath, such as the following, to pledge allegiance to Britain. Over the following decade, many returned to South Africa and never signed the pledge. Some, like Wrights, eventually reconciled themselves to the new status quo, but others could not. Union of South Africa. One of the most important events in the decade after the end of the war was the creation of the Union of South Africa. It proved a key ally to Britain as a dominion of the British Empire during the World Wars. At the start of First World War, a crisis ensued when the South African government led by Louis Botha and other former Boer fighters, such as Jan Smuts, declared support for Britain and agreed to send troops to take over the German colony of Germans Southwest Africa. Many Boers were opposed to fighting for Britain, especially against Germany, which had been sympathetic to their struggle. A number of Bitterenders and their allies took part in a revolt known as the Maritz Rebellion. This was quickly suppressed, and in 1916, the leading Boer rebels in the Maritz Rebellion got off lightly, with terms of imprisonment of 6 and 7 years and heavy fines. 2 years later, they were released from prison, as Louis Botha recognized the value of reconciliation. Thereafter the Bitterenders concentrated on political organization within the constitutional system and built up what later became the National Party, which took power in 1948 and dominated the politics of South Africa from the late 1940s until the early 1990s, under the apartheid system. Effect of the war on domestic British politics. Many Irish nationalists sympathised with the Boers, viewing them to be a people oppressed by British imperialism, much like, in their opinion, themselves. Irish miners already in the Transvaal at the start of the war formed the nucleus of 2 Irish commandos. The 2nd Irish Brigade was headed up by an Australian of Irish parents, Colonel Arthur Lynch. In addition, small groups of Irish volunteers went to South Africa to fight with the Boers. This despite the fact that there were many Irish troops fighting in the British Army. In Britain, the pro-Boer campaign expanded, with writers often idealising the Boer society. The war also highlighted the dangers of Britain's policy of non-alignment and deepened her isolation. The 1900 UK general election, also known as the Khaki election, was called by the Prime Minister, Lord Salisbury, on the back of recent British victories. There was much enthusiasm for the war at this point, resulting in a victory for the Conservative government. However, public support quickly waned as it became apparent that the war would not be easy, and it dragged on, partially contributing to the Conservatives' spectacular defeat in 1906. There was public outrage at the use of scorched earth tactics, the forced clearance of women and children, the destruction of the countryside, burning of Boer homesteads and poisoning of wells, for example, and the conditions in the concentration camps. It also became apparent that there were serious problems with public health in Britain. Up to 40% of recruits in Britain were unfit for military service, suffering from medical problems such as rickets and other poverty-related illnesses. This came at a time of increasing concern for the state of the poor in Britain. Having taken the country into a prolonged war, the Conservative government was rejected by the electorate at the first general election after the war was over. Balfour, succeeding his uncle Lord Salisbury in 1903 immediately after the war, took over a Conservative party that had won 2 successive landslide majorities but led it to a landslide defeat in 1906. Horses. The number of horses killed in the war was at the time unprecedented in modern warfare. For example, in the relief of Kimberley, French's cavalry rode 500 horses to their deaths in a single day. The wastage was particularly heavy among British forces for several reasons: overloading of horses with unnecessary equipment and saddlery, failure to rest and acclimatise horses after long sea voyages and, later in the war, poor management by inexperienced mounted troops and distant control by unsympathetic staffs. The average life expectancy of a British horse, from the time of its arrival in Port Elizabeth, was around 6 weeks. Horses were on occasion slaughtered for their meat. During the Siege of Kimberley and Siege of Ladysmith, horses were consumed as food once the regular sources of meat were depleted. The besieged British forces in Ladysmith also produced chevril, a bovril-like paste, by boiling down the horse meat to a jelly paste and serving it like beef tea. The Horse Memorial in Port Elizabeth is a tribute to the 300,000 horses that died during the conflict. British Empire involvement, see also History of the British Army. The vast majority of troops fighting for the British Army came from the United Kingdom. However, a significant number came from other parts of the British Empire. These countries had their own internal disputes over whether they should remain tied to the United Kingdom, or have full independence, which carried over into the debate around the sending of forces to assist the United Kingdom. Though not fully independent on foreign affairs, these countries did have local say over how much support to provide, and the manner it was provided. Ultimately, Australia, Canada, New Zealand and Company-ruled Rhodesia all sent volunteers to aid the United Kingdom. Australia provided the largest number of troops, followed by Canada. Troops were also raised to fight with the British from the Cape Colony and the Colony of Natal. Some Boer fighters, such as Jan Smuts and Louis Botha, were technically British subjects as they came from the Cape Colony and Colony of Natal, respectively. There were also many volunteers from the Empire who were not selected for the official contingents from their countries and travelled privately to South Africa to form private units, such as the Canadian Scouts and Doyle's Australian Scouts. There were also some European volunteer units from British India and British Ceylon, though the British government refused offers of non-white troops from the Empire. Some Cape Coloureds also volunteered early in the war, but later some of them were effectively conscripted and kept in segregated units. As a community, they received comparatively little reward for their services. In many ways, the war set the pattern for the Empire's later involvement in the two world wars. Specially raised units, consisting mainly of volunteers, were dispatched overseas to serve with forces from elsewhere in the British Empire. Technically the United States stayed neutral in the conflict, but some American citizens were asked to participate. Early in the war, Lord Roberts cabled the American Frederick Russell Burnham, a veteran of both Matabele Wars but at that very moment prospecting in the Klondike, to serve on his personal staff as Chief of Scouts. Burnham went on to receive the highest awards of any American who served in the war, but American mercenaries participated on both sides. Australia. See also History of the Australian Army. From 1899 to 1901, the 6 separate self-governing colonies in Australia sent their own contingents to serve in the Boer War. Much of the population of the colonies had originated from what was then the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland, and the desire to support Britain during the conflict appealed to many. After the colonies formed the Commonwealth of Australia in 1901, the new government of Australia sent Commonwealth contingents to the war. The Boer War was thus the first war in which the Commonwealth of Australia fought. However, it must also be noted that a few Australians fought on the Boer side. The most famous and colourful character was Colonel Arthur Alfred Lynch, formerly of Ballarat, Victoria, who raised the 2nd Irish Brigade. The Australian climate and geography were far closer to that of South Africa than most other parts of the Empire, so Australians adapted quickly to the environment, with troops serving mostly among the Army's mounted rifles. Enlistment in all official Australian contingents totalled 16,463. Another 5,000 to 7,000 Australians served in irregular regiments raised in South Africa. Perhaps 500 Australian irregulars were killed. In total, 20,000 or more Australians served and about 1,000 were killed. A total of 267 died from disease, 251 were killed in action or died from wounds sustained in battle. A further 43 men were reported missing. When the war began, some Australians, like some Britons, opposed it. As the war dragged on, some Australians became disenchanted, in part because of the sufferings of Boer civilians reported in the press. In an interesting twist, when the British missed capturing President Paul Kruger, as he escaped Pretoria during its fall in June 1900, a Melbourne Punch, June 21, 1900, cartoon depicted how the war could be won, using the Kelly Gang. The convictions and executions of 2 Australian lieutenants, Breaker Morant and Peter Handcock in 1902, and the imprisonment of a third, George Whitten, had little impact on the Australian public at the time despite later legend. The controversial court-martial saw the 3 convicted of executing Boer prisoners under their authority. After the war, though, Australians joined an empire-wide campaign that saw Whitten released from jail. Much later, some Australians came to see the execution of Morant and Handcock as instances of wrongfully executed Australians, as illustrated in the 1980 Australian film Breaker Morant. Canada, see also Military history of Canada. Over 7,000 Canadian soldiers and support personnel were involved in the Second Boer War from October 1899 to May 1902. With approximately 7,368 soldiers in a combat situation, the conflict became the largest military engagement involving Canadian soldiers from the time of Confederation until the Great War. Eventually, 270 soldiers died in the course of the Boer War. The Canadian public was initially divided on the decision to go to war as some citizens did not want Canada to become Britain's tool for engaging in armed conflicts. Many Anglophone citizens were pro-empire, and wanted the Prime Minister, Sir Wilfrid Laurier, to support the British in their conflict. On the other hand, many Francophone citizens felt threatened by the continuation of British imperialism to their national sovereignty. In the end, in order to appease the citizens who wanted war and avoid angering those who didn't, Laurier sent 1,000 volunteers under the command of Lt. Colonel William D. Otter to aid the Confederation in its war to liberate the peoples of the Boer-controlled states in South Africa. The volunteers were provided to the British with the stipulation that the British pay costs of the battalion after it arrived in South Africa. The supporters of the war claimed that it pitted British freedom, justice and civilization against Boer backwardness. The French-Canadians' opposition to the Canadian involvement in a British colonial venture eventually led to a 3-day riot in various areas of Quebec. Commonwealth involvement in the Boer War can be summarized into 3 parts. The first part was characterized by questionable decisions and blunders from the Commonwealth leadership which affected its soldiers greatly. The soldiers of the Commonwealth were shocked at the number of Afrikaner soldiers who were willing to oppose the British. The Afrikaner troops were very willing to fight for their country, and were armed with modern weaponry and were highly mobile soldiers. This was one of the best examples of guerrilla-style warfare, which would be employed throughout the 20th century after set-piece fighting was seen as a hindrance by certain groups. The Boer soldiers would evade capture and secure provisions from their enemies, therefore they were able to exist as a fighting entity for an indeterminate period of time. The end of the first part was the period in mid-December which is referred to as the Black Week. During the week of December 17, 1899, the British suffered 3 major defeats at the hands of the Boers at the battlefields of Stormberg, Magersfontein and Colenso. Afterwards, the British called upon more volunteers to take part in the war from the Commonwealth. The second part of the war was the opposite of the first. After the British reorganised and reinforced under new leadership, they began to experience success against the Boer soldiers. Commonwealth soldiers resorted to using blockhouses, farm burning and concentration camps to persuade the resisting Boers into submission. The final phase of the war was the guerrilla phase, where many Boer soldiers turned to guerrilla tactics such as raiding infrastructure or communications lines. Many Canadian soldiers did not actually see combat after getting shipped over to South Africa, as many arrived around the time of the signing of the Treaty of Vereeniging on May 31, 1902. New Zealand, see also Military history of New Zealand. When the Second Boer War seemed imminent, New Zealand offered its support. On September 28, 1899, Prime Minister Richard Seddon asked Parliament to approve the offer to the Imperial Government of a contingent of mounted rifles, thus becoming the first British colony to send troops to the Boer War. The British position in the dispute with the Transvaal was moderate and righteous, he maintained. He stressed the crimson tie of empire that bound New Zealand to the mother country and the importance of a strong British Empire for the colony's security. By the time peace was concluded 2.5 years later, 10 contingents of volunteers, totaling nearly 6,500 men from New Zealand, with 8,000 horses had fought in the conflict, along with doctors, nurses, veterinary surgeons and a small number of school teachers. Some 70 New Zealanders died from enemy action, with another 158 killed accidentally or by disease. The New Zealanders in South Africa 1899–1902, South Africa. During the war, the British Army also included substantial contingents from South Africa itself. There were large communities of English-speaking immigrants and settlers in Natal and Cape Colony, which formed volunteer units that took the field, or local town guards. At one stage of the war, a colonial division, consisting of 5 light horse and infantry units under Brigadier General Edward Brabant, took part in the invasion of the Orange Free State. Part of it withstood a siege by Christian de Wet at Wepener on the borders of Basutoland. Another large source of volunteers was the Witlander community, many of whom hastily left Johannesburg in the days immediately preceding the war. Later during the war, Lord Kitchener attempted to form a Boer police force, as part of his efforts to pacify the occupied areas and effect a reconciliation with the Boer community. The members of this force were despised as traitors by the Boers still in the field. Those Boers who attempted to remain neutral after giving their parole to British forces were derided as hensoppers, and were often coerced into giving support to the Boer guerrillas. Like the Canadian and particularly the Australian and New Zealand contingents, many of the volunteer units formed by South Africans were light horse, or mounted infantry, well suited to the countryside and manner of warfare. Some regular British officers scorned their comparative lack of formal discipline, but the light horse units were hardier and more suited to the demands of campaigning than the overloaded British cavalry, who were still obsessed with the charge with lance or sabre. At their peak, 24,000 South Africans served in the field in various colonial units. Notable units were the South African Light Horse, Remington's Guides, Kitchener's Horse and the Imperial Light Infantry. Notable people involved in the Boer War. Sam Hughes, senior militia officer and later a federally elected cabinet minister. As a very patriotic individual, Hughes became involved in the Boer War as a member of Brigadier General Herbert Settle's expedition after Hughes unsuccessfully tried to raise his own brigade of soldiers. Hughes was noted by his colleagues for having a dislike of professional soldiers, and he was noted for being an exceptional leader of irregular soldiers, whom he preferred to lead in combat. However, Hughes was dismissed and was sent home in the summer of 1904. Sending letters back home which were published outlining British command incompetence, his impatience and boastfulness and his providing surrendering enemies favourable conditions. When he arrived back in Canada, Hughes became very active politically, and he would eventually start his political career with the Conservatives. When he became a Member of Parliament, Hughes would be in the position to become the Canadian Minister of Defence and Militia in 1911, just prior to the outbreak of World War I. This was a position that Hughes would be dismissed from in 1916, due once again to his impatience, among other reasons. John Mackay, best known as the author of the World War I poem In Flanders Fields, Mackay started his active military service in the Boer War as an artillery officer. After completing several major campaigns, Mackay's artillery unit was sent home to Canada in 1901 with what would be referred to today as an honourable discharge. Mackay ended up becoming a special professor in the University of Vermont for pathology, and he would later serve in World War I as a medical officer until his death in 1918 while on active duty due to pneumonia. Harry Breaker Morant, Anglo-Australian poet and soldier who allegedly participated in the summary execution of several Boer prisoners and the killing of a German missionary, Daniel Hees, who had been a witness to the shootings. Court-martialed and executed for murder. Winston Churchill, best known as the Prime Minister of Britain during the main part of the Second World War, worked as a war correspondent for the Morning Post. He was captured and held prisoner in a camp in Pretoria from which he escaped and rejoined the British Army. He received a commission in the South African Light Horse and witnessed the capture of Ladysmith and Pretoria. Victoria Cross recipients, 4 Canadian soldiers in the Second Boer War received a Victoria Cross, which is the highest military medal available to soldiers of the Commonwealth and former British territories. It is awarded based on exemplary bravery and valour in the presence of danger. Sergeant Arthur Herbert Lindsay Richardson, soldier of Lord Strathcona's horse, Richardson rode a wounded horse, while wounded himself, back into enemy fire to retrieve a wounded comrade whose horse had been killed at Wolfsprout on July 5, 1900. Lieutenant Hampton Zane Churchill Cockburn, soldier of the Royal Canadian Dragoons, Cockburn received his Victoria Cross on November 7, 1900 when his unit was the rear guard at Lelya-Fontaine. Cockburn, along with fellow Victoria Cross recipient Lieutenant R.E.W. Turner, held off an advancing group of Boer soldiers in order to allow 2 Canadian field guns to escape along with their crews. Cockburn was wounded and captured by the Boer soldiers. Lieutenant Richard Ernest William Turner, soldier of the Royal Canadian Dragoons, Turner received his Victoria Cross during the same portion of the conflict as Cockburn. Turner was wounded in the conflict, however unlike Cockburn, Turner escaped. Turner would later become a high-ranking officer in the Canadian Army in World War I, Sergeant Edward James Gibson Holland, soldier of the Royal Canadian Dragoons. Holland received his Victoria Cross from the same rearguard conflict at Lelya-Fontaine on November 7, 1900 as Cockburn and Turner. However, Holland received his medal for a different reason than the 2 aforementioned lieutenants. During the Boer advance, Holland kept the Boer soldiers at bay with his carriage-mounted Colt machine gun despite the position becoming increasingly dangerous due to the proximity of the enemy. With his gun jammed and in danger of falling into enemy hands, Holland removed the Colt from its carriage and rode away on his horse with the gun in hand. Final overview: the Second Boer War was the harbinger for a new type of combat which would persevere throughout the 20th century, guerrilla warfare. After the war was over, the entire British Army underwent a period of reform which was focused on lessening the emphasis placed on mounted units in combat. It was determined that the idea of cavalry was antiquated and improperly used on the battlefield in the modern warfare of the Boer War, and that the First World War was the final proof that cavalry had no place in 20th century combat. Yet some British soldiers held dear to the fact that cavalry was put to better use after the reforms in the theatres of the Middle East and World War I, and that the idea of mounted infantry was useful in the times where the war was more mobile. An example of this was in the First World War during the Battle of the Mons, where the British cavalry held the Belgian town against an initial German assault. The Canadian units of the Royal Canadian Dragoons and the Royal Canadian Mounted Rifles fought in the First World War in the same role as the Boer War. However, during, and after, the Second World War the regiments swapped their horses for mechanized vehicles. The Second Boer War was also the beginning of types of conflict involving machine guns, shrapnel and observation balloons which were all used extensively in the First World War. To the Canadians, however, attrition was the leading cause of death in the Second Boer War, with disease being the cause of approximately half of the Canadian deaths. Canadians ended the war with 4 Victoria Crosses to its soldiers and 2 more Victoria Crosses were given to Canadian doctors attached to British Medical Corps units, Lieutenant H.E.M. Douglas and Lieutenant W.H.S. Nickerson. Not all soldiers saw action since many landed in South Africa after the hostilities ended, while others performed garrison duty in Halifax, Nova Scotia so that their British counterparts could join at the front lines. Later on, contingents of Canadians served with the paramilitary South Africa Constabulary. The war also had its fair share of controversy, as Commonwealth soldiers used a scorched earth policy as well as concentration camps to subdue the Boers. A total of 116,000 women, children and Boer soldiers were confined to the Commonwealth concentration camps, of which at least 28,000, mainly women and children, would die. The British saw their tactics of scorched earth and concentration as ways of controlling the Boers by eliminating the decay and deterioration of the national character, and as a way of reinforcing the values, through subjugation of citizens and the destruction of the means for the Boer soldiers to continue fighting, of British society that the Boers were rejecting by engaging in a war against the Commonwealth. The Boers saw it as a British ploy designed to coerce the Boer soldiers into a surrender. With approximately 10% of their population confined, many of whom were women and children. The Boers suggested that the British were forcing the Afrikaners to return to their homes and protect their families who were in danger of internment. Commemorations. Every year, cities and towns across Australia celebrate Boer War Day on the 31st of May, organised by the National Boer War Memorial Committee. In Canberra, a commemorative service is usually held at the St John the Baptist Anglican Church in Reid. Floral tributes are laid for the fallen. See also, category, People of the Second Boer War, Boer Foreign Volunteers, Bombardment in the Second Boer War, British Logistics in the Boer War, History of South Africa, List of Second Boer War Victoria Cross recipients, London to Ladysmith via Pretoria. Account of the war by Winston Churchill as a newspaper correspondent accompanying the troops, Military History of South Africa, Opposition to the Second Boer War, The Absent-Minded Beggar, Volksdort, References. Further reading, Jones, Morrig. Blockhouses of the Boer War. Colonial Conquest, McWebb. Archived from the original on May 13, 2008. Retrieved May 10, 2008. Cartwright, A.P. The Dynamite Company. Cape Town, Purnell & Sons, Davenport. Saunders. South Africa, A Modern History. ISBN A0-8020-2261-8. Fmont Barnes, Gregory. The Boer War 1899–1902. Excerpt and text search, Judd, Dennis, and Keith Surridge. The Boer War, A History. Excerpt and text search, Pakenham, Thomas. The Boer War. New York, Random House. ISBN A0-394-42742-4, Vessels, Andrew. Copyright. Afrikaners at War. In Gooch, John. The Boer War. London, Cass. Steele, David. Salisbury and the Soldiers. In Gooch, John. The Boer War, Direction, Experience and Image. London, Cass. External links, media related to Second Boer War at Wikimedia Commons, media related to Memorials of the Boer Wars at Wikimedia Commons.